always talk about the Arc of Virginia. That's literally my job. But I'm also going to talk about the Arc of the United States. And that's because we collaborate with them, with the Arc. They have amassed an incredible amount of resources on this topic. And they've been working on it for years. So they provide training and work in prevention areas across the country. And so some of the slides, some of the information, I've left their logo on here because I got to take it directly from them. So I want to make sure they get credit for that. Excuse me. So there are 600 chapters of the ARC across the country, and we are the state chapter of the Arc of Virginia. We have 23 local chapters here in Virginia. So the program or initiative really that the Arc of US started was back in 2013, and it's called Pathways to Justice. They have multiple projects and initiatives as it's been going on for many years now, but Pathways has been there for quite a while, and it trains and equips your first responders on working with people with developmental disabilities. They've got disability response teams that are very similar to some of the things that are being developed now across the country when looking at policing. They often focus on mental health. We'll talk a little about that later and some of those differences, but I think really the Arc of US was ahead of their time in what's now becoming everywhere because of the moment that we're in and all the things that our country has gone through, a refocus on community policing and approaching relationships and policing in a very different way now. Excuse me, I'm getting over an awful cold. I don't think that switched. There we go. So I want to provide their contact information because, like I said, there's a ton of information there. So we're going to go through some things, but you can always reach out to the center to get more information on the justice work that they do. So first, I want to talk about what law enforcement needs to know about working with people with disabilities. So who were we talking about? We're talking about people with all disabilities. In some ways, we focus on developmental disabilities, but a lot of what we're going to discuss can translate or is relevant to people with other types of disabilities. So the cold hard facts, 2 in 10 prisoners and 3 in 10 inmates in jails report having a cognitive disability. That's the highest disability that's reported in prison systems and jail systems. And 25% of people who were exonerated after they've given false confessions have an intellectual disability. So we see that it's happening over and over, that people with disabilities are overrepresented in the prison system and in the criminal justice system. They are incarcerated more often. They receive higher sentences, longer sentences, and often don't have access to the programs, whether they're rehabilitation programs, diversion programs. Those things aren't always accessible for them to be able to take advantage of. More data that matters is 1/3 to 1/2 of the people who are shot by police officers each year have a disability. The Journal of Public Health talks about the fact that young people with disabilities are 13% more likely to be arrested than their peers who don't have disabilities. And then for young Black men, that jumps to 17%. Same thing, people with disabilities have an overall 43% chance of arrest, and that burden and disproportionate risk falls much higher on young Black men. So we see there's a problem. These stats are real, and we see it in our work all the time here as an advocacy organization doing information and referral. We see people getting caught up in the criminal justice system really too often. And once you're caught up, it's a very difficult system to get out of. And there's really a domino effect to the things that happen in your life. So here are some of the things that are pretty common that lead to the negative interactions. Sometimes it could be what might be seen as suspicious behavior or odd behavior, but that can be all sorts of things, right? That could be someone who doesn't use words to communicate, who is perceived as being non-compliant or ignoring the directions or the commands or questions or requests from an officer. Someone who's deaf, who just simply may not hear a question or a command. There are people who don't have full body control, right? Or they move a little bit differently. And so that could be misperceived as being aggressive, combative. Other things might be someone might be somewhere that they didn't realize they shouldn't be. You know, like they're just caught up in a place, in a situation that they don't even know that they need to be. That they shouldn't be there. I tell you, in our work, because we do a great deal of information referral, individual advocacy cases, and we talk to other advocates who do the same work. And frankly, the most common thing that we're seeing are arrests for sexual misconduct. And this is misunderstandings. This is unintentionally or unknowingly breaking the law. It might be a young person, quite often with autism, on the internet and looking at it's pretty easy to get down a rabbit hole on the internet in general, but clicking on something that gets linked to talking to someone on the internet who might be under 18. This is very, very common to be taken advantage of, misled, and truly just misunderstand the situation that someone is in. You may all be able to think of other issues or things that you've seen. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Have you started screen sharing?
Oh,
it just occurred to me, I'm not seeing your PowerPoint. So
y'all are missing it too. It's absolutely beautiful and you are missing it. No. So sorry.
Not at all. I've done the same.
Here we go. Thank you. Tell me if this.
There we go. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you stopped me because I would just keep going. Yeah, so you all may think about the work that you do and the people that you know, yourself, your own interactions or family members, things that you can see that could be misinterpreted, that lead to involvement with police officers and first responders. A lot of times people are manipulated into crimes, particularly people with cognitive disabilities. IDD are very vulnerable to that, being pulled into something. There are also domestic disturbances, whether that's at your home and a person who is not able to regulate, maybe they're not able to kind of regulate their emotions at that moment, whatever they're dealing with, and the police get called because of the actions and behaviors. Someone wandering off, all sorts of things happen, and the risk is pretty significant. Okay. So another thing we want to think about and really remember is that developmental disabilities and mental illness need to be treated differently in the justice system. They are different. Both need immense amount of attention. We're not taking away from any attention, but I think too often they just get lumped in together. And when they are lumped in together, I can tell you that the mental health disabilities receive much more attention, whether that's from lawmakers, elected officials, social work and the system itself. When we talk about behavioral health, the Department of Behavioral Health, that covers all things, right? It covers your developmental disabilities, covers substance users, mental health issues. But that really does get much more attention in the public as well as in the system. So developmental disabilities, you all know this, but as a reminder, it's often, but not always, affects cognitive abilities. But there's a really wide and really broad range of impacts and of ability. It's lifelong, typically. The onset is before age 22, as Elizabeth mentioned, but it is also lifelong. There's no such thing as recovery. You're not really gonna get a cure. You're going to always need those supports. There are absolute supports and interventions that make life better and make life easier, help a person to access their community, live their life to their full ability, but they're not going to be cured. Mental illness, on the other hand, it doesn't typically interfere with cognitive abilities. Some of these things are chronic, some are temporary, come back, or episodic, they come back and go away. So a person might receive treatment and then not need treatment for a long period of time and come back for treatment. A person can experience recovery to a degree, and some people completely. But the focus is on stabilization and treatment and recovery through medication and therapy combined. Whereas in developmental disabilities, the focus is on helping you and helping a person, supporting a person with formal and informal services just to live a life like me and you, just to access their community, whether that's at work, getting a job, keeping a job, doing those things that we all do at home, grocery shopping, cooking, all of those life skills. So the two approaches are very different for good reason. But we also want to remember that about 35% of people have co-occurring disabilities. So they have a developmental disability and they also have a mental health diagnosis. And when you look at how you approach someone, you think about which of those things are a bigger impact, a bigger impediment in their life. So when we think about people getting caught up in the system now, it's like, so what's the answer, right? People are getting caught in the criminal justice system. We see the risk when we're having interactions with police officers. So now we think about what are some of the answers. We know the first thing people say, understandably, is training, because we absolutely need training. But we also need a paradigm shift away from just intervention and thinking about prevention. So now that I'm sharing, I can't see hands raised and things, so I won't ask the question. I have a habit of asking questions, but I'm not going to know if you answer. So most of the training, I would ask if you had heard of CIT, if anyone knew what that was, which is crisis intervention training. And most of that training that takes place, it is across the country. It's used in many places. Many places it's a requirement for officers, and it's pretty extensive. But that focus does tend to be on the mental health issues, and it's absolutely focused on intervening in a crisis. So a crisis is already happening, and now we're going to learn how we intervene, as opposed to learning how to prevent or avoid a crisis. And so I think that's appropriate in a lot of the mental health circumstances where police may be called to a scene, showed to a scene because a person is in crisis already. That CIT training is designed to improve the way that law enforcement and the community respond to people experiencing that mental health crisis. It's built on relationships between law enforcement, mental health provider agencies, people with mental health issues and their families and support system. And it's been very beneficial to helping officers understand what to do during a crisis, and providing tips for de-escalation. That's probably one of the more common focuses, is de-escalating a situation. But only a fraction of the time is spent on the topic of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I think I was talking to someone in Virginia the other day who works in the court system. And I think it's 2 hours out of a multi-day training that developmental disabilities are discussed. So IDD is very different and distinct from mental illness and requires targeted training that really can use the strengths of the CIT program, the things that have been learned, the lessons of what's been effective and what's not been effective, but then tailored to the needs of the IDD population. It's going to be about building relationships. It's going to be about avoiding crisis. This is part of what the 𝐸𝐸 of the United States, through the center that we mentioned earlier and the Pathways to Justice, it is a training for officers on all of these areas. So we need the increased training. We need the paradigm shift so that we redefine a crisis. Because sometimes I think a lot of people think that that most often when people with IDD come into contact with officers, they are in crisis already. They're in a crisis situation. And so that's what CIT is always focused on. However, people with disabilities are often not in crisis, but it can easily become a crisis when there's an interaction with first responders or the police. And it probably appears that the majority of things happen of these cases when someone's in crisis, but that's because those are the things that make the news, right? But the more common situation is that people are not in crisis, but that the situation can quickly develop into a crisis if the disability goes unrecognized, ignored, and not accommodated, to make sure that there's effective communication, effective interaction between the officers and the person with a disability. They need to be able to notice those signs, recognize those signs so that they can effectively communicate and help a person to avoid going into a crisis. We know of several of these situations, high profile, some here in Virginia. There's been a couple of traffic incidents, car accident. And while it's not a behavioral health crisis when it starts as just a car accident, but it becomes a crisis when that lack of understanding between the officers responding and the person experiencing that need. And that lack of understanding leads to crisis. And you have to think there are all kinds of reasons that we might call the police. We could be a victim of a crime. We could, be a witness to something. There are lots of things that could lead to you needing to be involved or in a conversation with police officers. In fact, we're going to talk a little bit later about a work group, the Marcus Alert, and I'll share a short story from there from one of our self-advocates who he described himself as a non-speaking autistic, and he was in his neighborhood. He shared this story with the group there that he was in his neighborhood walking one day by himself. I think he was out walking his dog, I'm not sure. And he saw someone, he saw an altercation or a confrontation that looked very tense. And it was between a police officer and a young man who also had autism and was non-speaking. He was getting really elevated because he couldn't be understood, right? And he was very, very scared. And this young man that I'm referring to, his name is Ben. He is okay with sharing that. He was able to intervene. I mean, just what an incredible coincidence that a person who doesn't use words to communicate comes across another person in their neighborhood who doesn't use words to communicate and was able to intervene to calm down the young man. And luckily Ben's mother was also on the walk, and she was a little ways behind, but she noted and came over and was able to talk to the officer. But that could have gone horribly wrong. With the officer not knowing what that person was trying to say, and then perceiving, mistaking his actions as noncompliance or, God forbid, aggression. That's what leads to really horrible outcomes. Now I want to shift what we talk about a little bit, and we'll still save questions for the end, but the two kind of conversations are a little bit different. This is about what's happening to address all of these issues, right? What's being done in Virginia right now to do some of the good things like training that we just talked about. So I want to share a bit about the work that the ARC of Virginia has done with its advocacy network in what I call evening the scales, right? The scales of justice. So we, this gentleman here in the picture, his name is Brian Kelmar. He is a parent who is a member of the ARC. We've had a long, many years of relationship. He is a parent who has an incredible passion for this issue based on his personal experience of having a son with autism who was arrested, prosecuted, and charged with a crime. He's presented on these issues nationally many, many times and wanted to address the legal ramifications here in Virginia. And so he and a group of other families who have similar experiences with the criminal justice system work closely with us, and they've actually now spun off and formed their own nonprofit. It's called 𝐲𝐢𝐬𝐀𝐿RID, which is made up only of families and people with disabilities, focused on the mission of legal reform for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But these families that were members of the ARC and part of the ARC is how we got started in our criminal justice work. Not just these families, but definitely Brian Kelmar. So we focus our work on legislative change. How can we affect the issues that I mentioned, all of the risk earlier, through legislation and policy work, through General Assembly, but also through state agencies. And so in 2018, we started partnering with those families that I mentioned that later became 𝐲𝐢𝐬𝐿RID. But we started by looking at the issues and using our experience with legislative advocacy to seek justice in the criminal justice system for people with disabilities. We evaluated where change needed to occur, then sought partners in the legislative body who have this as an interest area, and there are many. There were a handful then. I will say now, fast forward to 2021, based on all of the things that's been going on related to policing and criminal conduct of our officers, the legislative body is much more. There's a huge number of people interested in and have a really strong appetite for making change in this area. So it's made legislation and it's made advocacy work easier. So we look at it as a continuum, the criminal justice reform that needs to take place all throughout where a person could be involved with the process. So we talked about training, which is vitally important. We talked about a shift from intervention to prevention. And that's where some of this comes in, because this legislation thinks about, we want to avoid, we all, I think it's safe to say, want to avoid the criminal justice system. And so we want to start with that prevention. And the area that we looked at, because the most cases that we were encountering involved the sexual misconduct that I mentioned, our prevention focused on working on sex education, family life education, specifically for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I'll go into a little more detail. And so the prevention is, let's try to get it where we don't run afoul of the law in the first place. And then we move to the second, okay, if that doesn't work along the continuum, then let's say we are arrested for something and we are going to trial and court. We want consideration. We want the fact that a person has a disability to be able to be entered in, to be considered as evidence in a trial. So let's say that doesn't work, all else failed, then we go to diversion. So We're now in a court. We've considered the person's disability, but there is a finding of guilt. This law creates the opportunity for courts to divert and defer sentencing. So there may be a judgment of guilt, but we can defer any sentencing for instead supports and services, receiving supports and services. Last, if all else fails and someone is in the prison system, we have noted and found through our work that there are incredible deficits and holes in ensuring people's ADA rights are maintained and protected in the prison system. And so these 4 things along this continuum are all new laws in Virginia that we've worked on since 2018. Excuse me. And so the first is prevention. This was HB 134. This actually passed in 2020. Worked on it for a couple of years, but it took a couple of years to pass. Very common for any of you who do legislative work. But it is family life education, and it required that the Department of Education meet with a variety of stakeholders and that they come up with a curriculum and recommendations on age and developmentally appropriate instruction related to sexual health, self-restraint, protection. How do you protect yourself? Respecting personal boundaries and privacy, and knowing those personal boundaries and knowing what those are for other people, understanding age differences despite your developmental age, because that happens too. Someone may not recognize that a person on the internet who is 12, maybe I feel like I have a lot in common and I'm 19, but my developmental age is such that I feel there's more in common. It's making sure that they can recognize and avoid unintentionally offending in any way. And so this did go forward, and the Department of Education created those guidelines and sent it out for public comment. And that's where we are in the space right now as far as the process for this being fully implemented is public comment has come back, and I don't believe we've seen the final recommendations. But these guidance documents are very close to being complete and will go from the Department of Education to each local district, because what was happening in Virginia very frequently prior to this law was that people were opting out. Parents of students with IEPs and students with disabilities in many cases were just opting out of sex ed, family life. And many times it wasn't the family. It was assumptions, false assumptions by educators and teachers who felt, oh, this person has IDD, and they don't need family life education. And they're just, that couldn't be further from the truth. All of our bodies develop. All of these things are true. We're growing into adults, regardless of what type of disability that we may have. This all is going to happen. And so it was really important to make this and I'm going to say a requirement, but it's a requirement to be offered, to have the guidelines there. And then it is required that every school discusses this sexual health and family life education in every student's IEP. A parent still has the opportunity to opt out through the IEP process, but this ensures that the school district is not unilaterally making decisions that are often based on false assumptions and generalizations about people. Okay, consideration. This bill actually, while I showed you the continuum that made sense in order, right? Well, these didn't pass in order. This actually just passed and became law 2 months ago. So it became law July 1. And this was a really tough one. This was very hard, but we partnered with the mental health community and the patron that we work with wanted this. But there were very hard choices in these discussions that the General Assembly grappled with. but they can't, fortunately, I think, they really did come out in the right place, where this now allows for a person's intellectual or developmental disability or mental health condition. That was really the sticking point. They did not, frankly, lawmakers did not want to include mental health. This was a time that we were happy to stand with our partners in the world of mental health advocacy, and we said that we supported and wanted mental health included. It's usually the other way around. It's always mental health bills that we have to go and get ourselves included in. But this time, that's not the way it was. There's too many fears from the governing body, really, that this would cover too many people. But the fact is, it's not. It's really about taking a whole person into consideration, so that can be considered during a trial proceeding. It's actually throughout the entire proceeding. So it requires judges to consider this information during pretrial, during bail hearings, bond hearings, all of those stages of the process. These facts are known and considered. And prior to this law, it could not be entered into evidence that a person had an intellectual or developmental disability or autism or a mental health condition. So it's a huge change. I actually included, it's a little small for me to read, but the quote from the patron, Senator McClellan, and also Delegate Bourne. But the senator said, and she's right, for too long, our criminal justice system has disproportionately punished Virginians with mental illness, autism, intellectual and developmental disabilities. This legislation, defendants with these conditions will now be able to have their full story considered in court. Thought it was a really nice way to put that, because it's true. It's about the whole person. And that this is probably one of the most significant changes to our justice system in recent years. She said this came from an article that was done. So we were very happy to get this moved forward. Diversion, as I mentioned, that went through in 2020. And I think I described that already. It really is about offering up the opportunity for supports and services in lieu of a judgment or a sentencing. Okay. Accommodations. This has been a very active group. This was the one I mentioned where, okay, all else fails. Now we've gone into the system. What we were finding is that people are experiencing significant harm in the prison system based on their disability. And this is coming from misunderstandings, misinterpretations, mislabeling of people that leads to them not receiving proper medication. They're not going in with the medication. Maybe I was on a seizure medicine, and then I go in and they mistake all of these things and start giving me schizophrenia medicine. These things are happening. These are actual individual cases that we've worked with. And so we worked with Delegate Hope to form a work group that's been meeting for well over a year. And this is HB 659. This work group, because it's such, it's complex, it's a complex system, right? It's really been interesting. I'm used to sitting on all the disability things that I sit on, and this is a very different world, of course, understandably. But we're talking about everything, because right now, when you go into the prison system, if you go into the prison system, you are screened for mental health, for mental illness. There's a screening tool. It's built into the policy and practices of the Department of Corrections. But guess what? There is no such screening for intellectual or developmental disabilities. So that's one of the tasks. We've got to be able to screen people to know this information. It always makes me think about the stat that we shared earlier of the 3 in 10. It's probably well beyond that. because there are many other states that don't screen. There are some states that do, obviously, but I'm sure that there are many others that are in the same boat as Virginia, that we're catching up on this kind of information. And so we want to get people screened so they're identified and can have access to the accommodations that they need, that they're getting their right medications. Accommodations might also include different ways of receiving information, understanding the instructions that are coming from correctional officers. We need to be sure, because it can and again be a domino effect when someone is there and they're not understanding the instructions, and so then they're labeled as not being compliant, and that leads to more punishment and other circumstances. The other piece is looking at policies that cause harm, particularly for adults with or people with autism. When you think about solitary confinement, so the Department of Corrections, I have to say, has been just wonderful to work with, very open to these discussions, open to figuring out where are the places that improvements need to be made, because a person's rights under ADA apply everywhere. I know in some ways that makes you think, okay, but I've been accused of a crime, found guilty of a crime. Maybe I don't have all the same rights. You have your ADA rights, Americans with Disabilities Act, to ensure that you are accommodated and that your disability is considered and taken into consideration throughout your care. And the prison system has the duty of care for all of their residents. That is something that exists. So this group will have recommendations coming out, I hope by November 1st. I anticipate by November 1st, and there may be follow-up legislation. But if not legislation, there'll be policy changes within the Department of Corrections to make some of these corrections that ensure that people's rights are protected. This last bill that I want to talk about, it was not our bill. The others were bills that the ARC of Virginia wrote, drafted, and pushed forward as part of our legislative agenda. But this was the Marcus David Peters Act that you may hear called the Marcus Alert System, if you have heard of it. This came out of a very unfortunate case of a young man being shot and killed by the Richmond police in 2018. He was experiencing a mental health crisis. His family has done an incredible amount of advocacy and work to make sure that this moved forward. So it was some time in the making, but it's a really important piece of legislation or law now that I really hope has a significant impact on everyone in Virginia. So this is about reimagining policing and community safety. The first thing we did when we began to look at it and certainly support the bill, we asked to have IDD added because it was originally written with Marcus in mind and what he had experienced through a mental health crisis. But the drafters and crafters, creators of the bill and legislation also felt that it was appropriate to add in the consideration of people with IDD. So we were pleased to be able to have that happen and get involved with that. So then we were able to be part of the committee. We have 3 people who are adults with developmental disabilities, person of color, and who has that intersection of having a disability, and of course the rest of the risks that go along with the identity that she has as a person of color, and another young woman who utilizes a wheelchair, and that Ben, who I mentioned, non-speaking autistic, as he describes himself. I share that because they wanted to be a part of the group because of the diverse things that they bring to the table. Someone who doesn't walk to move and ambulate and get around, someone who doesn't use words. They really felt that these were varying enough perspectives that the committee needed to benefit from their viewpoint. And so when we met with a larger stakeholder group, they sort of voted and talked about who should represent that group on this Marcus Alert group. And I think that they made a good decision. It's been wonderful seeing their participation in the process. So we've also hosted several community listening sessions that were specific to the developmental disability community to hear what are they facing, what's happening in their day-to-day life. And that was all part of building what will now be the Marcus Alert system. That system will be made up of co-responders, co-response teams. This has gone on in other states as well. But what it does mean is when you call for help, you will be met with an officer and then also someone from one of these community care teams. That used to always just be a mental health specialist. So it's going to be a community care person who's received training in all of, kind of a social worker of sorts, who has training in all of these different areas to be able to intervene in the moment in the right way. And so that's the biggest piece I see from Marcus Alert. But the other pieces are the way you get access that. So they will be adding a new emergency number, 988, actually, so that if I am, and we hear from families all the time who their child is not able to self-regulate and is having what would be called a behavior by some. And calling for help is a very scary thing, particularly for Black families, Black and brown families. It is a terrifying prospect. And so you could dial, instead of dialing 911, you dial 988, and you're going to have this co-response coming in. The planning committee that we're a part of are very aware that it will take a huge amount of public information to get 988 out there, right? I mean, that it takes a lot to get that level of publication or publicity so people know that and have it ingrained, right? It's because if you're in an emergency, we've all got 911, but before that we didn't, right? It took a while for that to come into our consciousness as the thing. So I think it'll take a long time for this to change. So another aspect of the legislation is there will be, or the plan for implementation is there'll be training for 911 operators, so that if a person dials 911 and they are experiencing a behavioral health crisis, that operator can recognize that. They can screen for that, and then they could divert the call. So even though I called 911, I can still access that co-response system. Another thing that's going to be part of it that actually Ben, who I mentioned earlier, really pushed and advocated for was a volunteer registry. It's very important to say volunteer. This is just for anyone who wants to register their household, for example, with their local police department of this is my address, this is where I live, I have a developmental disability, or I have autism, or I can't speak, or I can't walk, whatever it might be, so that if you have an emergency, God forbid, your house could catch on fire, anything, any emergency, it's in a registry, so first responders can be aware of the situation that they're walking into, so they can go with the right support. So that's a volunteer registry that will be part of this. This all starts, I believe, and I should know this 100%, but I'm gonna say 80% sure, that it is starting in January. I am sure that it starts in 5 regions. It's not gonna roll out in every district, in every region, and every sheriff's office and police department around the state all at once. That just really wouldn't be possible. And so it is going to start in 5 regions, and you can go on the website for the Marcus Alert. And I didn't put it in here, but I can send it. But you could also, if you just Google Marcus Alert, it will come up. It's a DBHDS site. And they have information there on the implementation process. So, and we're going to get that information up on our website as well to be a resource to our individuals and families. And there is a current request for proposals grant process for projects that aim to support the implementation of the Marcus Alert system. So that is, and I think it might be the right time to be at the question and conversation time.
Absolutely, Tonya. Thank you. What a thorough coverage of the problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're going to open it up to questions and answers. I hope all of you will be thinking about what those questions might be. Go ahead and put them in the chat box. We've gotten just a few there, and I'll scroll through them and we'll go ahead and get those answered. Would like to be sure you know that Tonya's first entry in the chat box is the link to Pathways to Justice, which is the initiative to the 𝐲𝐢𝐬𝐀𝐛𝐢𝐥𝐢𝐭𝐲 on Criminal Justice and Disability, of which you spoke. So if anybody wants to know more about that, the link is right there. Okay, Tonya, one of our first questions here is from Rebecca, and she says, we often hear about the school to prison pipeline and how students with disabilities are disproportionately involved with the criminal justice system as a result. Is there anything going on in the education realm to address this in Virginia?
You know, that is a great question. We hear the same thing a lot. I may not have the best answer as far as a specific answer. I know that it's talked about a lot in Department of Education, right? It's definitely talked about in the advocacy community. I think one of the places that you see this and hear this is in the regulations for restraint and seclusion in our school system. Because a lot of times those policies are overused on students with disabilities for sure, but also students of color. As those interventions happen, they're very harmful. They cause harm, and it's another one of those, I say it a lot, domino. I don't know why I've said it so many times. I've never played dominoes in my life, but it has this continual impact that when you're restrained and you're secluded, that's likely going to lead to more negative actions and behaviors that are just going to continue the cycle of you being restrained or secluded. Those are not appropriate responses to students' behaviors. They are not. And many advocates are pushing for a ban, a full ban in the school system. And I think that could have an impact on that school to prison pipeline as you're stopping some of that negative cycle early on. But I don't know of any specific things that are happening right now.
Okay. Thank you, Tonya. So Tom has a question. Is the training on IDD to be part of the general training for court-appointed attorneys, or is it going to be offered as a separate CLE for all attorneys? Many of the best defense attorneys don't accept court appointments. What training is being provided to magistrates?
Yeah, there are a lot of training conversations that go on, and each of the bills that I mentioned, training is called for in a variety of ways. There are different implementation phases, but they were each called for because you have to just keep saying it, right? What I don't know is if it would be separate from what the attorneys are already receiving. The pieces in the Marcus Alert that focuses on responders and law enforcement officers, but some of the other bills that I mentioned, 1315 especially, and 133 the diversion bill, I'm sorry, the numbers aren't going to help you. The diversion bill and the recognition of a person's disability both included training components for legal staff. And I believe it was for court-appointed attorneys. I don't know that it mentioned anything. I mean, of course, it could be open to private, but it's very hard to get it in there. We've tried to do that, and I know of some other groups. Advocacy Partners is the name of an attorney who has a small nonprofit who has worked to get in and try to provide some of that training. So I'm sorry, I don't have an exact answer for if it would be part of the same CLE or if that would be separate.
All right, thank you, Tonya. So Renee asks, if I'm not mistaken, I believe laws in other states similar to the family life education one here are getting resistance and not always being implemented. I know it is still pretty new, but are you seeing this here in Virginia?
Yeah, it is still new. There was resistance from some of the lawmakers in the beginning. It actually took us 2 full sessions to get it to go through because it was, it's just a difficult topic, I have to say. It shouldn't be, but family life, that's why we have to call it that. We can't call it sex ed in Virginia, and I think in many other states where you don't have a chance of getting it through. So because it's at the place right now where the Department of Education has created the guidelines for the local districts, but it's not been handed to the districts yet, I can't say whether there's going to be resistance. I do know that both, is it VCU or JMU? One of the universities is working on a training program, I believe it's JMU, that really working on a curriculum that schools could access, that they could partner with schools to provide this education to students with developmental disabilities. And the Down Syndrome Association of Greater Richmond has done the same thing through a grant. So the appetite is there from the trainers and educators. I apologize, I thought I had closed that off, to do that work. But we're yet to see how it's accepted.
Okay, thank you. Now, Nicole asks, how does REACH fit in with the Marcus Alert system when the number becomes live?
It could be. It is intended to work together. REACH is part of DBHDS as well as Marcus. And so if the person has a developmental disability, they will be able to call in as part of that. I don't know what the right word is, the structure that's built, let's say, the protocol, that's what I meant, protocol for when a person has a developmental disability that we call one of the REACH specialists that can possibly, if they don't go as a co-response, they could be called after, but it is being integrated into the protocols for Marcus.
Oh, good to know.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I have a question, Tonya. You mentioned at the beginning that there's a high percentage of those in the corrections system that have cognitive impairments, and research shows that that percentage includes a very high number of individuals with brain injury, not necessarily ID.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just wondering why the laws that have come about recently, in particular, why they haven't acknowledged the brain injury community, which is a large community, especially when we talk a lot about inclusion. Why are these laws coming about that seem to restrict certain disabilities?
You know, that's a great question, and one I had not thought about. I think we all get in our lane, so to speak, and unless we're reminded, so I kind of take responsibility for that because we, put those things forward, and it is always the focus to think about IDD. But you're right, there are so many things that a person with a brain injury might experience that would be similar, that their actions or steps or whatever it might be could be misinterpreted, or even the processing of information and instructions, that sort of thing. So the answer isn't a great one, which is just that we didn't think of it. And maybe there's, opportunity for the ARC and Autism Society and Down Syndrome Association to bring in conversations with the Brain Injury Association, and other groups to see where that could be addressed and where that could be rectified.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Another question would be do you ever recommend that the individual with the disability self-identify when they encounter a first responder and there seems to be an altercation in the making? Would it be
either
wise
you're frozen or oh, there you are. I think you were frozen for a second, or I was.
Okay, so the question is, would you recommend that a person with a disability self-identify at the beginning of this encounter with a first responder to maybe head off a problem?
Yeah, and I think it's up to each individual, but I think in that circumstance where you're trying to avoid a problem, absolutely. That goes very similar to the registry that's being created. I have heard of systems, and I should be able to know this, but I believe we have it in Virginia as well, where you can carry an ID card that indicates your disability. And I believe it's being tied to DMV and car registrations. So I would recommend and kind of offer the advice that if you feel that you're in a circumstance where the stakes are so high, when you're standing across from a person of power and authority, which is a police officer, regardless of how they should be acting, they absolutely have some level of threat on their side, literally. So I think you do want to make sure they know everything they can about you that's going to help that issue go smoothly. But there's a lot of people who wouldn't be able to self-identify or articulate it. So I think that's where some of those IDs and other crisis emergency personal planning can come into play.
All right. Now, Nicole wonders too, is the CIT going to be revised to include educating officers on interactions with the IDD population?
So the hope is to continue expanding. We have not seen, I don't think there's been success yet in actual changes to that curriculum. Whoever it's owned by, I think a lot of police departments, I think they kind of have that ownership now after it's been developed, since it was such a time ago. So we haven't been successful yet in advocating for it to be fully expanded and integrated in there. And I think that it might, the best approach sometimes you just kind of have to strategize about what's going to be the most successful. And in Loudoun County and another county or two here in Virginia, we've been able to use the Pathways to Justice so that it is a completely separate training, and it is viewed by the first responders and police officers as equally important, not an add-on, but that that they are separate and equal, but they are distinctive. And so sometimes I think that is our best strategy to ensure that disabilities get the recognition that it needs for all the caveats that go with it. So it really is just more about a strategy, as well as the opening opportunity that hasn't been there to fully expand CIT. So I think having both of those things required would be a really big win.
Yeah, good point. And speaking of brain injury, certainly that condition also needs to be addressed within the CIT trainings. So,
yeah.
All right. Someone made a comment she says a lot of individuals are wary of having their ASD diagnosis on their driver's license or ID card. They're afraid of telling DMV about their diagnosis and having that impact their license.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I can understand that. I can also understand it from you use your license and your ID for other things.
Right.
I may not just want to go telling my business to, I don't know, the checkout clerk because I'm buying beer or whatever, I need to show ID. There are other things we use our IDs for. So it is that's why it's not that we go and tout it and recommend. We want to educate the community that it's an option for them, because there are a lot of people that really would not work for. I agree with, you said that was Nicole. I absolutely agree. It's just up to each person and their life circumstance.
Right. All right. Well, I think that we are maybe at the end of the questions, unless anybody else has one, they can slip it in real quickly. And in the meantime, Tonya, I am delighted with the time that you've given us today and your expertise. We hope this leads to more partnerships, more collaboration, more efforts in the interest of individuals with brain injuries when it comes to law enforcement. Certainly is a hot potato issue, and we need to be on top of it. So thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Bet.